One-layer cards continue to be a card-making technique staple because they're easy to share with anyone around the world. There's no added bulk from dimensional foam tape, and it will fit in your standard envelope without additional postage. With that being said, one-layer cards don't have to be thin and lifeless. Let's take a look at 3 card-making examples of how to liven up single-layer cards. One-layer cards don't have to be flat and dimensionless. There are easy tricks and ways to fake dimension without adding the bulk and the height to your card. So for my first example, I'll be using the Golden Days bundle. So this is the Golden Days layering stamp set. On the back I have the die set, simple coloring stencil, and the hot foil plate. This comes together and separately depending on what your needs are, but I will use all of these except for the die set for my card today. The first thing I'm going to grab out of the stamp set is just the sentiment, and that's really what I'm using the stamp set for. So you can substitute this with whatever sentiment you'd like on your card front. On an A2 craft panel, I'm going to plan for the placement of my sentiment from the Golden Days layering stamp set. In going through my stash, I found this washi tape, and I just went through my stash to find a washi tape that is slightly larger than my sentiment stamp. I ended up using this slightly skinnier tape and 2 layers of it just to get a nice silhouette for my sentiment stamp. Now I won't stamp this yet, so I'll set this off to the side. So now that I have my washi tape, I'm going to take a light gray ink. This is the Altenew Crisp Dye Ink in Limestone, and one of my mini ink blending tools. And I'm going to add a slight drop shadow. So I'm just slightly ink blending a little shadowy area right outside of the washi tape, as if my light source is coming in this way, which it is in my studio. So you'll see that effect is really light and subtle. I'm not going to remove the washi tape yet. In fact, it's going to stay on my card for the majority of my card making process. So now I'm going to grab just one of the layers of the Golden Days simple coloring stencil set, just so I can get my flower in a familiar orientation onto my panel here. So I want my flower center to be on my card, and so I'm just going to roughly align and lock the hot foil plate. And now that I have my hot foil plate in a familiar orientation and looking for key areas on my alignment grid, I can just remove the coloring stencil, and now I know exactly where, or roughly where, the hot foil plate will sit on my card front. While my hot foil system is warming up, I've already cut a piece of foil, slightly larger than the dimensions of the hot foil plate. And then once I have my black hot foil down, my hot foil plate to my cardstock and to the foil, just so that everything is where I plan for it to be. And so now I can pick this whole thing up, turn it over. Once I've turned the hot foil plate on its back, I can lay down my shim and the spacer pad on top of this, and this is how it'll lay on my hot foil system while the plate warms up. So that's one imprint of the black foil Golden Days impression. So I'll repeat that on this second half here by using the same steps. I'll use the simple coloring stencil to get my hot foil plate, once it cools down again, into a familiar orientation. And then I'll black foil onto this top part here on my card panel. So that's the second impression on my card panel. And again, I'm not going to remove this washi tape yet. So now I'll work on the next element to this floral card. What I'll need for this next segment is the Altenew masking paper, and I just have a few offcuts here to make masks of these 2 floral images. Since the hot foil image in Golden Days does not have a coordinating die, I can use the simple coloring stencil to get a rough placement of the image on my card front. In this way I can be a little bit more economical with how much masking paper I need to cut for my card front. So now I can use a pencil to trace the outline of the simple coloring stencil, just so I don't waste so much of my masking paper. And then I'll do the same for the other image. So then I'll just use my scissors to cut out the pencil tracing that I just made. Now that I have both masks on top of my foiled flowers, I'll work on the next element to my background. One of my favorite stencils is on the plus side stencil, and I use this quite a lot. And I just think it adds a nice geometric and modern element to any card. So I want my stencil to be in this kind of orientation. So what I'm going to do is slightly shift it down and to the right. Then I'll use a little bit of tape to hold that down to my craft mat. I'm going to use Evening Gray and my black family of small ink blending tools to ink blend through the stencil. And what I'm doing is getting a drop shadow, which is why I shifted the stencil on my card front down to the bottom left. Oh, sorry, bottom right. And I'm applying a light layer of this onto my card panel. And you'll see that's really nothing at all. Then what I'll do is bring my stencil where I wanted it originally, so top. So I'm going to shift my stencil up slightly, and to the left slightly. I'll tape down my stencil again. And this time I'll move on to a darker color. I'll actually use Lava Rock and my same black family of ink blending tools. So now I have a slight drop shadow on my plus side motifs, just to give that illusion of dimension and depth, instead of just a flat one layer card. So now I'll remove my floral masks. And when I was hot foiling, it looks like I lost a little bit of the drop shadow from my sentiment label here, so I'll just use Evening Gray, just a darker gray this time, instead of the limestone I was using earlier, to add that drop shadow back on. And now with hot foil, I get the impression of the hot plate itself onto my cardstock, which is fine. I think it adds a nice little touch. But now I can finally remove my washi tape that acts as my mask for my sentiment placement. Now with Lava Rock, I can stamp my sentiment where I just removed that washi tape mask. And my sentiment still stands out and looks as if it's on a little sentiment strip here. And just one final touch on this card. I really like the way black and white look on top of craft cardstock. So I'm just using that backing piece to my mask. And I'm just going to gently lay it over the flower. And then I'll use pure white ink spray to add an array of splatters to the plus side background. Once the white splatter has dried, I adhered my card panel to my folded note card base. And that finishes this one layer card, featuring a few masking ideas using washi tape and also the Altenew masking sheets to create an interesting, bold, and dynamic background with floral focal elements. New for February 2020 is the Craft Your Life Project Kit Never Stop Dreaming, and I'll follow many of the same principles as the first card on this second card. Again, with a nice bold focal element, this is a nice way to use your larger images, is on one layer cards. It just requires a little bit of masking and a little bit of creativity. And I love this project kit because in the die set, I already have a die that acts as a placeholder for my sentiment. For this project, I'm not going to use the simple coloring stencil set or the 3D embossing folder, so I'll set those over to the side. So the first thing I will need is a die cut mask of the apothecary type label included in the Craft Your Life Project kit. I'm going to center this label on my cardstock. And just as I did before, I'm going to take one of my mini ink blending tools and Morning Frost from the Warm Gray family of inks. I will create my drop shadow by ink blending off of my apothecary label, and I'm creating a drop shadow again. I added a little bit of intensity with Evening Gray just to the bottom part of my label. Now, just like the first card, I won't remove this mask. Instead, I'm going to bring out my larger stamp positioning tool, and once I'm happy with the placement of my stamped image, I'm going to use permanent black ink. This is an alcohol marker friendly black ink that doesn't bleed. I'm going to stamp this image onto my card panel. And to keep it symmetrical, I'm going to rotate this 180 and I'll stamp that image again. Off camera, I already cut two of the masks using the coordinating die from the project kit. And I will overlay this mask on top of my black stamped images. And just as a reminder, I did not remove this mask yet for my apothecary label, which is where my sentiment will go in the end of this card. And just for good measure, I did indicate that this is the direction I want my card to face. I don't want to accidentally glue this onto my folded note card base upside down. But alright, so I have my mask down, and I still have this in my stamp positioning tool because I'm going to stamp on top of all of this. To give the illusion of some embellishments without the bulk, I'll use the Tied with Love stamp set. It does come with a coordinating die, but I won't use it for this project. So first I've stamped one of these layers in Coral Bliss, and then I stamped the outside portions of the stamp in Heartbeat. Both of these inks are from the Tea Party family of red crisp dye inks. In total, I've stamped this image 3 times, making sure to rotate and orient it in different ways so it looks like it's organically wrapped around my cardstock. Before I remove these masks, I figured now would be a good time to add any splatters since a lot of my focal elements are already masked off. I'm going to use a little bit of pink pearl pressed onto an acrylic block, and then using a water brush to lightly splatter this onto my background. I'm always team splatter, but splatters are a great way to add one layer embellishments without adding the height of sequins, for example. And they just nicely fill up your background and break up some of the symmetry that you have on your layouts. I'm just using my Altenew micro tip tweezers to get an edge going when I lift up my masks. Now to break up some of the symmetry on my card front, I'm going to use the bow image off center onto my card front. And again, I'll use Coral Bliss as my base, just as the other layers of twine that I stamped earlier. And then I'll add a little bit of the illusion of depth by partially inking the stamp with Heartbeat. Actually, I want a little bit more depth, so I'm just gonna go all the way to Vineyard Berry as well, just to partially ink up the stamp. And there you can see just the little bits of where I added darker areas of red. To finish this card, I'm going to take one of my sentiments now and position it on top of the apothecary label. I've stamped my sentiment in permanent black crisp ink, and now before I take this to my folded note card base, I'll add a few more touches to give more of an illusion of depth. Since I was using the warm gray family of inks for my drop shadows here, I'll use the coordinating warm gray markers. It's in the set B, but you can get this set by itself. I will further enforce the illusion of depth by adding just slight lines under each of the pieces of twine. And for the twine that runs underneath the label, I'm stopping at the label to add these light gray streaks of marker. And then I'm going to do the same for the bow, but this time I will go over both the flower motifs and on top of this masked area where I have my sentiment. And you'll see that doesn't require any sort of skill at all. And if needed, you could always use the Altenew blending marker just to lightly diffuse that edge if you need to. And then once I've glued this card panel to my folded note card base, that finishes another iteration of masking to create a dimensional, and again, without the bulk, 1-layer card. So my last perfect pairing doesn't require a lot at all. In fact, Altenew has released a wonderful new category, which are these beautiful coloring sheets. They come in watercolor, alcohol marker sheets, and they're just a really quick and easy way to create a card. So in the Whimsical Flower Bunch coloring sheet set, there is this sheet, which I find really perfect for making a single layer card because, well, my sentiment is already on here and all it requires is a little bit of coloring. And before I start coloring the sheet, I'm using one of my transparencies that I've made with some leftover stamp packaging, and it's just going to help me gauge and center my sentiment onto my card front, since these Whimsical Flower Bunch coloring sheets are 6 by 6 inches. And my template is an A2 size template. Now I won't cut it out yet. You can if you want to, but I'm not going to cut mine out. I think it just gives me a little bit more to hold on to and a little bit of maneuverability while I'm coloring. But anyway, I'm going to use the Sunshine Valley Garden set. of Altenew artist markers to color this image. But instead of coloring the images themselves, I'll be coloring the outside of it so that this illustration shines through. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to create some abstract forms throughout this panel, and I'm going to ensure that I don't color the image themselves. It's as if I'm just coloring the background. And I'm just going to cycle through the colors in this sheet, just making some amorphous shapes. And I'll keep making these shapes all throughout the background. So that's my first layer of this terrazzo type motif throughout my background. And I'm really going to try to be conscious to fill in as much of this background as I can. So I will even add a few little dot motifs as well throughout my background, just to fill in a lot of this empty space. And I really enjoy adding these dot elements to this background because I feel like they complement the paisley motifs that are so characteristic of Mendi and henna arts. Now this background is mostly done. I'm done with the markers at least, so I'll set those off to the side. What I'm going to take next are the Altenew fine liner pens, and I want the 01 nib. And with the 01 nib, I'm going to trace anything with an outside line. So I won't trace every single outline found in this sheet. And this is just going to help this stand out. And this is just going to help it stand out a little bit more against the colored background. And playing with line weight is just a really rudimentary way to add a little bit of art and style to your coloring. So after tracing all of the outer outlines of this image, hopefully you can see now that it stands up a little bit more. But now one of the last things I'll do is take the 02 fine liner pen and outline just the letters. And after bolding the outline of just the letters in Hope, so after bolding the letters with the 02 nib, now I'm going to take the 05 nib and add a little bit of shading to the motifs that are underneath the letters with a few stipples from the 005 liner brush. So what I mean is I'm adding dots in higher concentration towards the letter, and then I'll feather those dots out. So what I mean is I'll show you it on this swirling motif here. I'm going to add dots closer to the letter and then feather them out just for a little bit of shadow. So after adding in the stippling dots, I'm going to go ahead and cut my panel according to the pencil lines that I made earlier. So after trimming down my panel and adhering it to my card base, this is my card featuring a really easy technique of coloring outside of the lines essentially. So now I've created a really amorphous background, and by using a few stippling and line weight techniques, I'm able to add depth and dimension to the already existing illustration from the Whimsical Flower Bunch coloring sheet. My series encourages you to shop your existing Altenew stash and rekindle their love with newer releases. Perfect Pairings with Jaycee airs on the Altenew channel every second and fourth Sunday of the month. Please make sure you like and subscribe if you haven't already. Thank you so much for tuning in to this perfect pairing episode with me, and I'll see you in the next one.
Hello there! Did that video just spark your creativity? And do you want more project ideas and inspiration videos too? Well, if you do, please make sure that you subscribe to the Altenew YouTube channel. Also, make sure that you do click that notification bell so you don't miss a video. Thanks so much for watching. Bye bye!